Let's move on to the Arp Synth. In the first 2 bars, you get this pattern here, where we go from highest note to the lowest to the one in between. But then when we move on to the next chord, and specifically the one after that at bar 3 here, you can see the pattern just changes to a regular down pattern. Which is a little bit odd. It's a bit of a strange thing to have separate patterns inside an arpeggiator. I do know sometimes Ableton's arpeggiator and Logic's arpeggiator can have an issue if you start one of the notes a little bit too late. It can cause weird things like this to happen. And if we do a little bit of reshuffling, we can actually get all the chords to be in their regular state. So if we move the top note of this first chord down an octave, basically to undo the inversion that was already applied, I'm also going to move this top note back down to the octave below. And that's going to reverse the stretched voicing that was already applied to it, where again we move that third note in our triad up an octave. And you can see we end up with a G minor chord at the beginning here, first, third, and fifth. We end up with another G minor chord here as well, but it just starts on the second note instead of the first note. But the main thing about these chords is that top note. And that's why I think all the notes have been moved around and the pattern has changed slightly, is because they wanted the top note to follow the melody of the trumpet pattern, of course. And let's look at the relationships between these chords and the bass notes underneath. So I'm just going to draw the bass notes in. And now you can see when we get back to that G minor chord at the beginning there, paired with the E flat on the bottom, that E flat gives the chord a whole completely new meaning. Now the root note of our G chord is the third, the B flat is the fifth, and the top note up here, the D, is a seventh note, which provides a little bit of tension. In this original pattern, as you can see, the top note is our third note again, following the trumpet, and then the notes in between are the seventh and the fifth underneath. But from that third chord, kind of the second chord onwards, we just get more regular voicing where we've got the G as our root note. The root note is the bottom note there. Then we have the fifth in between, and then the third note on the top, but again, an octave above. And it's pretty much the same for these 2 chords. The fourth chord here, the fifth chord, is the same as the first one, of course, again. I can imagine this is probably written by ear or on a piano, or just programmed in one note at a time. Probably just using the trumpet line as the top note there, and then placing all the other notes in just so they fit around this too. The other good thing about this arpeggiated sequence is it doesn't move around a lot in terms of the range of notes. Using inversions, moving notes up and down octaves, helps you keep a nice tight window in which your notes live in. So you can see our highest note up here is the D4. The lowest note down here is D2. So we've got a 2 octave window there for all of our notes to live in. And this means that we have a lot less crossover with our low end of our bass, so they don't start to get in each other's way and start to become muddy. And another thing just to point out about the rhythm here, they've got 3 notes in all of these arpeggiated chord sequences, which creates that syncopated rhythm because we're using 3/16 notes. Now our piano chords at the beginning, there are kind of 2 layers to this. We have the main chords underneath here, which again, pretty much just follow the bass line, the trumpet pattern. And then we have this melody above. I'm just going to focus on the chords for now, and we'll come back to the melody in a minute. And these chords are quite simple overall. Root note down on our bass. We have that stretch voicing I was talking about before, where the third note has been moved up to the octave above. But we also have an additional fifth note on top here. Nothing too crazy with these. They're meant to be more of a layer in the background of the song just to help harmonize all the other instruments around them. And the melody is quite an interesting melody though. If we unmute this and bring this back in. The melody's used a little bit in the first house drop, but it's not used anywhere really after this point. And if it is, it's very, very quiet in the mix. The rhythm of the notes is quite interesting, again, because it's that syncopated rhythm where each note is a 3/16 note length or a dotted eighth note, as we talked in previous videos too. And it resets, as you can see, every 2 bars when it comes to this next section. The actual melody itself is just the same pattern. As you can see, top note, move down a step, then we jump down 4 extra steps to the note below. And then you can see the same happens here. Top note, down a step, 4 extra notes as well. But where these are placed are quite interesting based on the chords underneath. Looking at the root note of our first chord, the E flat, this is the E flat up here. The interval between the first note and E flat is a fifth, perfect fifth. Then we have a perfect fourth. And then this note here, which is really the most prominent note within this melody, because of course we rest and play on it for quite a while, is actually a major 7th interval from that E flat. So it creates quite a lot of tension. As you can hear there, we have this small F in here that is basically a passing note that blends up into that next section. And the next section is a lot nicer overall. Again, if we compare the root note, we've got the G. The first note in here is the root note. We drop down to the minor 7th note underneath, which creates a little bit of tension, but then we resolve down to this B flat, which is the minor 3rd interval there, which is quite a pleasing interval. So tension here, release. If we were to look at the pentatonic scale, minor pentatonic, ignoring the chords underneath, you can see the sequence does mainly use notes that are within that pentatonic scale, resting on the D there and the B flat. And we do have notes that are outside of the pentatonic scale, which is just the A again, as we talked about before, which is avoided quite a lot within the whole song. And having that in there just creates a slight element of tension that's then released on the next note, but we never hold on that note for too long. Otherwise it might become a little bit jarring. Now let's talk about the drums and the bass. And the drums and the bass in this song aren't very complex at all, really. The drum pattern at the top is just your classic standard drum and bass pattern, where you've got the kick on the first beat, snare on the second, the kick then on the off beat in between beats 3 and 4, and then our snare on the 4th beat. And that pattern just plays over and over again. There are a few slight changes in between different big sections of the song. And the hi-hat pattern above mainly focuses around the 8th notes and the quarter notes, or the beats within the drum pattern. You can hear our hi-hats here. Nothing too fancy, just playing on those 8th and quarter notes, accentuating them with the kick and the snare. We do also have, it sounds like there's some kind of alternating clap as well that comes in on the second snare to layer on top. But it's extremely simple, and the bass of course is very similar too. Just playing that 8th note pattern as well. And this is often called a rolling bass line. It's really just used to make sure there's a very strong driving energy in the track. Because as soon as you start to add in other kick drums, snares, bass notes that aren't on those 8th notes, for example, if we put one in here, it's going to start to draw your attention away from the other elements of the song, which are actually the more important elements in a track like this. And one other thing to point out about the structuring of this song is that if we were talking about the key elements of the track, of course, we've got the drums, we've got the bass, we've got the vocals, we've got that trumpet lead synth here, and the arpeggiated synth as well, along with the chords too. And you'll notice the main piano chords you can see being used in the breakdown here. All 3 of those elements are eventually used in the build-up, but a lot of them are filtered out, loads of reverb, so you can't really hear them that well. But they never really overlap for too long. So you see at this point here, the piano chords and the Arp Synth play, and they are very clear when you play them together. The They do have very contrasting rhythms though, which helps them stand out from each other. And then of course when we get into the drop, only the trumpet sound plays. And then when the trumpet stops playing, the arp starts to play. And this just helps to keep the track nice and clean, not muddying up your track with too many sounds. Because of course we also have the vocal that lives on top of pretty much everything within this song. And speaking of vocal, let's talk about the vocal. I've recreated the vocal melody in a synthesizer here, just so we can look at what is happening, why it works so well, because the vocal is very, very catchy. And the vocal, of course, is an original vocal from Julia Church. And again, it's not too complex. It's quite simple. And of course, they've looped a section of that vocal during the drop, which really lifts the whole song. And we mainly have 3 different sections. We've got the breakdown section in here, the build up, and then the chorus or the drop. So this is the breakdown, and you'll just have to imagine that the vocal's obviously playing in the background because I've just got a saw wave on this. So let's take a look at the vocal melody. I'm going to turn the scale mode on. Let's go into the minor pentatonic. And you can see, once again, we're mainly using minor pentatonic notes apart from that A sharp. But once again, we're not resting on that note for too long, so it's not going to create too much tension. Same goes for that second build up section. You can see we just have the one note right at the end there. And then in our main drop, we have, again, just a very light use of that A note as well. And the bass in this section is a little bit different to the bass in the drop. And looking at the intervals, you can see we have E flat as our main root note here. So we start on the D there, which is the 7th note, 7th, 6th, 5th, 4th. And these are all quite fast, these notes here. So you don't really focus too much on the pitch of those notes. The main ones that we'll be focusing on are the ones that are rested on here, like the B flat and the G. And as you can see, the 5th and the 3rd interval. And when we lead into the next chord though, it does change slightly. First half of the melody is the same, but now because our bass note has changed, that interval has changed too. So G to D is a 5th, 4th, 3rd, 2nd, 3rd. And then we actually rest on the 4th note, which is a slightly tense note, as you'll hear. You can hear it just creates a little bit of tension in the vocal, which again is quite nice in a breakdown section like this, because when we come into this next section, all of that then gets released. We have a big change in melody here too. E flat up to F, that's the 2nd, 3rd, that's the 6th and the 5th that we rest on there. Again, more stability. And then we have our root note up here, 5th, 5th, root again. That would be our 7th interval, and then it moves up to the root note at the top again for some stability just before we move into the next section. And as we get into this build up, we get a much more simplified melody. E flat is our bass note. You can see the F here is the 2nd, the D is the 7th note. So again, tension in the first half, which is then released in that second half there, the 5th. A little bit of tension here. We're going from the 7th to the 5th, 7th, 5th, 5th, 7, 4, 4th, and then back up to the 5th again. Always landing on the last note of that 5th to help just tame any interesting movement that you've done before. And it's important to look at our vocal here. You can see there's this trend of the notes slowly increasing in pitch as time goes on. Starting very low in the breakdown, coming up to this middle point in that build up. And then right at the end, of course, we get the highest notes of the vocal in our track. And if you are writing any kind of vocals, this is a great technique to do to bring some energy into your chorus from your verses. And it's going to provide a nice lift, as you can hear. If we look at this melody, This is kind of a tale of two halves with this main melody in the song here, because the first half is really tense. It uses some fairly uncomfortable intervals to create tension that is then released in the second half. If we look at the notes again, you can see here's our root note of the bass and the chords that are playing underneath, the E flat up here. And these first three notes are actually the fourth, the second, and the seventh, and they're all very tense intervals. Our regular chord, of course, is the first, the third, and the fifth. So the fourth, the second, and the seventh are all in between those. And the tension's kind of relieved very slightly just leading into the next chord with this G here, because of course that is our third note within that chord. And because we've been talking about it quite a bit in this video, just to give you a demonstration what I'm talking about with tension and release, if we change these chords to sound quite nice and work really well with the bass note underneath. So I'm going to shift all of these notes here up one step. And now the intervals are E flat, we've got our root note on the bottom, the third and the fifth, third and the fifth in there. And then of course you can hear the second half over there, but this just demonstrating that idea of creating tension to then release it just gives your track a little bit more character than just using the notes of the chord that you are playing. And as I was saying before, the G helps release a little bit of this tension, but the real tension release is this section here. This of course being the section that is then looped later in the main drop and in the build up as well. And if you look at the notes in here, we've got G as our root note underneath everything. You can see we have the fourth note on the top here, which is a little bit tense, but we've got the third, and then we really focus in on that root note of G there. As you can see with those big eighth notes that rest on G. And as I said before, this is the part that's used over here as well. And the bass moving around underneath it's going to give it loads of different harmonizations. The main thing about this type of writing and this theory that we're talking about though is that normally a lot of singers or artists wouldn't necessarily be thinking about what intervals they're using when they are writing a song. A lot of the time they'll just make up a melody on the spot using their gut instinct and what they think sounds good. But it is a little bit more useful if you don't play an instrument and you find it difficult to have that gut instinct of what's going to come next. You can use some of the things we've been talking about in this video to help program some more interesting leads and melodies too.